With so many comic book superhero and superhero-adjacent movies underperforming this year, only a fool would say that superhero fatigue isn't real. In my opinion though, it's been overhyped as a way to excuse the mistakes of certain studios when it comes to their over-budget paint-by-numbers formula that isn't raking in the cash that it used to. Any cinephile worth his or her salt knows that Hollywood spins in cycles, and that in any given time period, there will be at least one genre that dominates the movie scene. Therefore, it is inevitable that the sheer dominance of the comic book movie we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is coming to an end, but that doesn't mean we don't still need superhero movies. And that brings me neatly to the subject of today's video, the movie that, while not exactly the first comic book superhero movie, gave us the hunger for more, and showed the world why we need comic book heroes in the first place.
They would have you murdered. All you'll ever be.
So I'm gonna skip the synopsis today, because you know this story. Alien planet blows up, only survivor's a baby who comes to Earth, Martha...
Why did you say that name?
Daily Planet, Lex Luthor, yada yada yada. Instead, let's talk about Superman's real origin story, which starts in the 1930s. To say the 30s were unpleasant for most people is a bit of an understatement. The Great Depression was keeping the poor poor, and people had lost faith in the American dream, the idea that with the right morals and work ethic, anybody could rise from poverty to make something of themselves. In the midst of this, two men, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, came up with a comic superhero they called Superman. Early versions of the character bear almost no resemblance to the modern iteration, one of them even looks more like Lex Luthor, but by the time he made his debut in Action Comics in 1938, he had evolved into the Superman we know today. The character was a breath of fresh air for the cynical and the impoverished, a well-needed reminder of the power of idealism even in the darkest of times, and that reminder became all the more important as the Second World War stirred to life in Europe. In a few short years, Superman became the most recognizable comic book hero in the world, a distinction that remains to this day, albeit with some stiff competition from a certain arachnid-themed teenager and a moody vigilante. However, the morally unambiguous Superman did have lulls in his popularity when the post-World War II world started drifting back to jaded uncertainty. In the 1970s, American culture was deeply troubled following the war in Vietnam and the fallout from the Watergate scandal, both of which had shaken the country's faith, leading to an undercurrent of angst and dissatisfaction. America needed to believe in something again, and who better to give her that than the Man of Steel? Before I get into the production of this movie, I want to disclaim that there is a lot of conflicting information and rumor-mongering out there, much more so than in most of the movies I've covered. A lot of it has to do with a long-standing beef between director Richard Donner and producer Pierre Spangler, neither of which is what you would call a reliable narrator. And if you want the spilled tea on that subject, you'll just have to wait until I inevitably cover Superman 2. Therefore, when it comes to this video, I'm going to go ahead and cite a few of my primary sources, which include the audio commentary by Ilya Salkind, multiple Warner Brothers making-of documentaries, a Richard Donner interview published in The Hollywood Reporter, the AFI production notes, and yes, maybe a handful of source links from Wikipedia. With that in mind, I've left out a lot of potential apocrypha that many fans might be expecting me to talk about, because if I couldn't get at least two reliable primary sources on something, I omitted it from my script. Okay, disclaimer over. Moving on. Our story begins with Ilya Salkind, who came third in a line of film producers, beneath his father Alexander and his grandfather Mikhail. Born in 1947 in Mexico with a Mexican/Jewish/Russian heritage, he became a producer of his own at a very young age, working with his father on the back-to-back production of 1973's The Three Musketeers and 1974's The Four Musketeers. Around that time, he had the idea to turn Superman into a movie. At this point, Superman had certainly appeared on screen before, in serials, on TV, in an hour-long B-movie starring George Reeves, and in several animated shows, but no one had ever properly translated a comic book hero as famous as Superman into a full-length film. But Ilya, in a burst of youthful optimism, not only wanted to make one film, but two at the same time, just as he and his father had done with the Musketeers. Ilya and his father partnered with Pierre Spengler, and at a cost of $3 million, secured the Superman rights for 25 years from Warner Bros. And DC Comics, which had several contractual stipulations thrown into the mix, including the need to approve the casting and to preserve the quote-unquote integrity of character, especially in regards to the main man himself. You may not realize it, but we've just skimmed over several days of me researching the Gordian knot of DC Comics movie rights at the time, getting a migraine, and deciding not to talk about it. If I ever make a video on Batman '89, we'll revisit, because things got messy, to put it mildly. Anyway, with the rights in hand, it was time to find a writer, and Ilya Salkind first approached William Goldman, based on his work on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Goldman didn't think it would work, and so other writers were considered, including Lee Brackett and Alfred Bester, before the job ultimately went to Mario Puzo, the writer most famous for The Godfather. Puzo's script, which covered both movies, was a hefty one, clocking in at somewhere between 400 and 600 pages, depending on who you ask. Given that a single page of a screenplay roughly estimates to a single minute of screen time, that would mean Puzo's script was approximately 8.5 hours long. Now, since I don't make enough YouTube money for a hefty charitable donation to Dartmouth College in order to take a look at their copies of Puzo's original scripts, I can't tell you much more than that. Suffice it to say, Puzo was more than willing to let other people take a crack at it, as he was completely spent. Among the other writers that had a hand in what would eventually become the final script are Robert Benton, David and Leslie Newman, George MacDonald Fraser, and Tom Mankiewicz. As for the director, several names were floated around, including Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, William Friedkin, Richard Lester, Peter Yates, John Gillerman, Mark Robson, Irwin Allen, Ken Russell, Roman Polanski, and Sam Peckinpah, the latter of which didn't get the job because he allegedly pulled a gun during his meeting with producers. Ilya really wanted Steven Spielberg, but, unable to pry him away from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he eventually hired Guy Hamilton, director of Goldfinger and Battle of Britain. Unfortunately, when filming changed from Rome to London, Hamilton had to drop out over complicated tax issues, and he was replaced by Richard Donner, who impressed the Salkinds with The Omen. Donner was getting lots of phone calls in the wake of that film, but Ilya was offering a cool $1 million, which was impossible to resist. The topic of today's video was voted on by my patrons, so I want to go ahead and thank my $8 patrons, Batty Bat Firebrand, Chuck Poor, John Burrell, Mike O'Connor, Numinous 2019, Robert McGill, Scott Johnner, Sean Vale, Spoats, and Warren Davis. I also want to go ahead and thank my other patrons, as well as my new channel members, which, if you didn't know, I now offer memberships on my channel. Memberships? Memberships. Anyway, thank you guys for your support. It really means a lot to me. It's really hard to make money on YouTube with the constant threats of demonetization and age restrictions and copyright bots and all that stuff. So you guys give me at least a more predictable income stream, and I do appreciate that. So anyway, now that I'm done with that, let's go ahead and get back to the video. According to producer Ilya Salkind, he pushed from the very start to put an unknown in the title role. However, he was outvoted by his fellow producers as well as the executives at Warner, who all wanted a big name. Alternatively, according to director Richard Donner, he was the only one pushing for an unknown. Either way, though, lists of box office stars were assembled by all involved. Among the actors considered, approved by DC, interviewed, and/or tested are, in alphabetical order, Warren Beatty, James Brolin, Charles Bronson, James Caan, Neil Diamond, Bruce Jenner, Chris Christopherson, Paul Newman, Nick Nolte, Robert Redford, Burt Reynolds, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, Jon Voight, and Christopher Walken. Christopher Reeve, who wasn't exactly an unknown at the time but was a pretty obscure actor outside of theater circles, was considered fairly early on, but nearly rejected for being too thin and young-looking. However, he was able to bulk up relatively quickly and secure the role after multiple impressive screen tests as both Clark Kent and Superman. Long before Reeve was cast, though, even before Donner was brought in, they managed to secure Marlon Brando, one of the biggest actors of the time, to play Jor-El. Ilya Salkind reports that when Brando was first suggested to him, he laughed it off as a lark, but was convinced by his father to reach out anyway, just in case. For a hefty salary of $3.7 million and nearly 12% of the profits, Brando agreed, though he had to be convinced to do it in person, as he had proposed just doing it in voiceover, as a Kryptonian could easily look like, in his own words, a green suitcase or a bagel. Brando was only contracted for 12 days of work, and he refused to memorize his lines, preferring to read them from cue cards hanging in various places off-screen. While it's easy to see this as mere diva behavior, and make no mistakes, Brando was a diva, he claims his performance was more authentic when he didn't have to focus on recalling lines from memory, an argument that many actors continue to make. Given Brando's megastar status, no one was gonna argue with him about it anyway. Ilya wanted Dustin Hoffman to play the primary villain, Lex Luthor, but Hoffman wasn't interested. Once Brando signed on, Gene Hackman, who was eager to work with the screen legend, agreed to do the part after only a couple of days of negotiation. In addition to their scenes for Superman, both Brando and Hackman also filmed their scenes for the sequel, which was still planned to be filmed at the same time. Brando's footage wasn't used in the theatrical release of Superman 2, though, and I'll explain why when I cover that movie. For the female lead of Lois Lane, Ann Archer, Leslie Ann Warren, and Stockard Channing were tested, but the role instead went to Margot Kidder, known at the time for Sisters, Black Christmas, and The Great Waldo Pepper. Donner insisted that she be forbidden from wearing her contact lenses during the shoot because he felt her performance was more authentic when she was bumping into furniture and looking confused. Make of that what you will. Other actors worth noting are Jackie Cooper as Perry White, Ned Beatty as Otis, Glenn Ford as Pa Kent, Trevor Howard as this Kryptonian, Valerie Perrine as Miss Tessmacher, and Terrence Stamp as General Zod, setting up his more prominent role in the sequel. There are also a few cameos from Rex Reed and Larry Hagman, along with early performances from John Ratzenberger and Richard Donner's staple Steve Kahan. A couple of cameramen and other crew show up in a few shots as well, but I don't think that was intentional, while the OG Superman and Lois, Kirk Alyn and Noel Neill, show up in a deleted scene. Filming began in late March of 1977 at Pinewood Studios in London. Location shooting took place in New York, Alberta, and New Mexico, with multiple crews working simultaneously in 3 different countries. When things went over budget and over schedule, plans to shoot both films simultaneously were dropped. The ending of the sequel was switched to the ending of the first movie, which was originally supposed to end in a cliffhanger, and tensions between the director and the producers reached such a boiling point that director Richard Lester, who was actually suing the Salkinds at the time, was brought in to mediate between them. Richard Donner allegedly threatened to kill Pierre Spengler, but it's hard to know now how seriously he meant it. One of the biggest sticking points was the effects, especially the all-important effect of Superman flying. The Salkins wanted to keep the budget down, but Donner was able to convince them to spend more money on more sophisticated techniques, including the use of a brand new, lighter front projection rig, the development of which had to be funded by Warner Brothers rather than the Salkins. Multiple different methods were used to achieve the flying sequences, from that new and more versatile front projection technique to simple crane and wire rigs and blue screen compositing, the latter of which caused multiple headaches given the color of Superman's costume. There are also a ton of miniatures, and the glowing Kryptonian suits actually came about as a result of an accidental discovery during front projection tests, where reflective 3M material seemed to shine in the light of a projector pointing into a mirror. After Jerry Goldsmith dropped out due to scheduling conflicts, the music was composed by the legendary John Williams, who crafted one of the greatest superhero themes of all time. Debate me all you want, but no other Superman or Avengers theme even comes close. I'll consider the animated X-Men theme or Danny Elfman's Batman theme, but those are the only real contenders. Superman, alternatively called Superman the Movie, released in December of 1978, missing the 40th anniversary of Superman's Action Comics debut by roughly 6 months. With one of the more well-known taglines in Hollywood history, "You'll believe a man can fly," Warner Brothers ran a marketing campaign that was more extensive and expensive than the norm at the time, though it would probably be considered incredibly light by today's standards. Critics lauded it, and it would earn a worldwide gross of just over $300 million, making it the 6th highest grossing movie up to that point, and still cracking the list of top 100 highest grossing films of all time, adjusted for inflation. Knowing exactly how profitable it was is a little bit trickier, because budget estimates vary wildly, with the most cited number being $55 million, itself the record for most expensive production up to that point. Other estimates confidently put the number north of $100 million. Even at the high end, though, the movie was clearly successful enough to continue work on Superman 2, which according to Richard Donner, was already 75% complete by the time Superman the Movie hit theaters. As for its legacy, Superman is arguably responsible for the entire genre of the big-budget comic book movie, though it would take some time for any other comic book film to achieve anything like its success. 3 sequels and 1 spin-off came out in the years that followed, 4 sequels if you include Superman Returns, and you have to remember that numbered sequels were actually pretty rare in 1978. The Salkins thought Superman could be fully serialized, like James Bond, with new movies coming out every couple of years. And though their initial franchise didn't last as long as they'd hoped, Superman movies are still around. James Gunn, who is now the public-facing head of film production for DC, is busy right now producing his own reboot of the property in Superman Legacy, scheduled to drop in the summer of 2025. As much as I trust James Gunn's track record, though, I'm gonna say something that might be a little controversial. I think, generally speaking, non-Americans understand Superman better than native-born Americans, and I recognize the irony of me, an American, saying that. You see, Superman is an American ideal, a stand-in for the old-fashioned aw-shucks morality of a place where anybody can have the freedom to improve themselves and build a better legacy for their children. He is the ultimate immigrant success story, a shining beacon of hope in a foggy murk of oppression and cynicism. That's why I think the original Superman and its first sequel are the 2 best film versions of the character, in large part because of the artistic vision of a foreigner, Elias Salkind, and why the more recent offerings by Bryan Singer and Zack Snyder fail to cut through the bitter self-recriminations of American psychology. Snyder's Superman is morally conflicted and melancholic, while Singer's Superman is too ashamed to even let the American way be uttered on screen.
Does he still stand for truth, justice, all that stuff?
While I do think the story is pretty corny, and the whole turning the world the other way thing is about the stupidest plot device I've ever seen, what makes Superman the movie work is its earnestness. Superman is irreproachably good, and that is an inherently difficult thing to be when the whole world is plagued by distrust, vice, and lost faith. There's an almost religious fervor underlying the movie, and I'm not even talking about the multiple Jesus parallels, in that it wants to reflect the absolute best of humanity in a character that is inhuman, to show America what it means to be American through the eyes of an outsider. As Jarrell puts it, he leads by example. I'm a sucker for that kind of thing, and I'm unashamed of my own heritage as an American. I do think being unafraid to be critical of ourselves and our history is a key aspect to what makes this country work, but at the same time, I think it is even more essential that the whole world be reminded of what we have been trying to build ever since we declared that all men are created equal. Maybe I'll be accused of jingoistic nationalism for saying it, but America is supposed to be a force for goodness, just as Superman is a force for truth, justice, and the American way. Like in the 30s and 70s, we could really use such a reminder in the 2020s. So I'm holding out hope that James Gunn can prove me wrong about what happens when an American is put in charge of the Man of Steel. But if he fails, at least we'll still have the original film, which perfectly encapsulates the meaning of Superman. On its 45th anniversary, we should all watch it, and remember that it is, unapologetically, a sci-fi classic. Oh, and to the pedants who want to complain in the comments about how it doesn't qualify as sci-fi because it's actually fantasy, I refer you to Marlon Brando's first words in the movie.
This is no fantasy.
And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Which Superman movie is your favorite? Let me know in the comments, and while you're down there, hit those button things I'm always going on about. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we'll talk about the first realistic rocket ship to ever appear on film, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.